I think I'm an inveterate educator. I can't help myself. When I get interested in something, I want to share it. I want to teach people about it. So that's what happened with this presentation. I had actually gone to the National Quilt Museum in Paducah, Kentucky, and 2 of their exhibits featured black women quilters. And I must admit, I knew something about it, but not that much. So I began to really do a lot of research and either discovered or remembered other African-American quilters. So originally when I presented this to my own quilt guild at home, I did it for, in between February, which is Black History Month, and March, which is Women's History Month. And so I called it Women's HERstory and Women Quilt HERstorians. So African-American women quilters were the first African-American historians because their stories were invaluable at a time which enslaved persons were denied literacy. The WPA slave narratives included references to the importance of quilts, but no actual quilts survived. However, today there's a really strong movement of black American quilters who are creating significant artistic pieces to focus both on past history and present struggles, giving viewers valuable cultural lessons as well as focusing on community and freedom. So this is a quilt I actually made before I knew about this. This is very controversial. A woman wrote a book based on something that was told to her by a grandmother or an aunt about the fact that slaves had codes and they could hang these in the slave quarters or on the fences so that people would know where to go. And so this is supposed to be, every one of these blocks is supposed to represent something about escaping to freedom, like the top middle one, the wagon wheel, and the lower right one, the Northern Star. However, a lot of professors and people who know a lot about history did a lot of research, and they found out that this was a myth, that actually slaves never had a quilt code, and no one in the African American community never even knew about it. So I made this quilt before I knew the truth, but I always try to say what the truth is, because having a fictional narrative about something that was historically accurate is really important. But I did make this, and it's meaningful to me, but I actually know it represents a myth rather than history. So now here is an actual real quilt. There are very few remaining African-American quilts. This was made by Harriet Powers, and she was born into slavery in Georgia. She made this in the 1880s, and she exhibited at the Athens Cotton Fair in 1886, where it captured the imagination of a young, internationally trained artist, Jenny Smith. The scenes in the 11 panels represent, well, first of all, they're done with a traditional African applique technique, but it represents biblical scenes, Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, so on, Cain and Abel. Jenny really wanted to buy this quilt, but Harriet Powers said not at any price. But later, Harriet's household fell on hard times, and Harriet did sell the quilt to Jenny. But she made Jenny promise that she could come visit it whenever she wanted, and also that Jenny would save all of the scraps from her sewing for Harriet so she could make more quilts. This is actually now displayed in the Smithsonian Institution's American Folk Art Museum. So this is also one of the few remaining quilts, and this was one by Lizzie Hobbs Keckley. She was actually Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker, and she would save the scraps, leftover pieces from making outfits for Mary Todd Lincoln, and then she would piece together some quilts. And this one is hers. I don't know, the screen isn't as big maybe as you can see the detail, but where the little green arrow is, that's the center of the quilt, and underneath the wing of the bird, it says Liberty. She actually spent her life after Lincoln, and the Lincolns were no longer in the president. Of course, Lincoln was assassinated, but Mary Todd Lincoln went on to live. But Lizzie Keckley actually became a sewing instructor at Wilberforce University, which is a historically black university in Ohio. And she raised money for the Underground Railroad and for African-American anti-slavery newspapers. They also made 250,000 quilts and comforters for Union soldiers during the American Civil War. This is an incredible quilt on the left, the title, 20 and Odd Negroes. A lot of the African-American quilts commemorate history in some way, and this is the unfortunate commemoration between 1618 and 1620 when thousands of Africans were enslaved. And if you look, if you can see enough, you can see that the ship that looks like it's wood is actually entwined body of slaves packed in a hold. And down the bottom, you can see there's a figure going into the water because some people, rather than being enslaved, wanted to escape just totally what was happening, and they dove into the water if they had a chance to die. Also, of course, many of the enslaved people were thrown overboard, especially women who were pregnant, because they didn't want to have to worry about the babies. And a lot of current African-American quilters use traditional fabrics, which is what you see on the right. That quilt is called Gathering of Spirits. This was fascinating when I saw this because it kind of reminds me of what the wall, the border wall in Mexico looks like. But it's actually Africans stacked up, lined up to wind up being slaves. 240 million African slaves ago is the title of this. This picture actually comes from a book called Still We Rise, which is African-American story quilts. And I think that's an important thing to remember about these quilts is they do tell stories. They're not just pretty bedspreads. And the other presentation that I did on Quilts of Social Protest was subtitled Not Your Ordinary Bed Cover. So these are works of art. You know, they're going to go on walls and they're going to go in museums. They're not going to go on people's beds. So this shows some of the kind of patterns that African-American quilting has. One is kind of block patterns, which is very sort of strict. Well, actually, both of these have very strict sort of geometric shapes, squares, triangles, things like that. But also the idea behind doing something like the quilt on the left was you could confuse the spirits who would try to follow you by having the quilt go in all different directions, kind of looking like a maze. I thought that was pretty interesting when I read about that. And then on the right side, the quilt is called Paul Robeson as Othello on Broadway. He was the first African-American to actually play the character of Othello, who is an African-American, or African, on Broadway with a supporting cast of white actors. And he took a really strong stance against racial intolerance. He refused to take this play to the South because he said that all of his performances needed to be shown before an integrated audience. And if you can't see it that clearly probably from where you're sitting, but the background is theater memorabilia. So this particular slide kind of demonstrates the wide range of techniques that could be used. On the left, it's so kind of soft and softer colors, flowing circles, the realism of the figures. But on the right, they're more stylistically primitive figures. So African-American quilting is going to come in all forms, just the same and represented in all different ways. This one is a homage to the Little Rock Nine, the first African-American students to integrate Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas in 1957. President Eisenhower, if you remember, had to federalize the National Guard and the U.S. Army troops in order to protect the students. Now this one I took a photograph in Selma. I went on an African-American civil rights history trip by Rhodes Scholar, which if you ever get a chance to do is extraordinary. But this quilt hangs in their library, and it was made by many people in Selma, which by the way had that terrible hurricane destroyed the town, and it is actually one of the poorest towns in America. But this commemorates things important in Selma history. A lot of them are religious symbols. You can see the church where, I can't use my pointer on this, but the church where the civil rights activists gathered to speak. And then the arrow, I show you the block that shows the bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge. This is amazing. You would think this is a photograph. It's not. If you look kind of closely, you can see some lines, you know, and that's because it's pieced quilting with different kinds of fabric that are dyed to look like skin, hair, and so on. This particular exhibit was also in the National Quilt Museum in Paducah, and it explores a lot of the issues that have affected and continue to affect Black women in America. When Emmett Till was murdered, his mother, you know the story, when she had his body shipped back to his hometown in Chicago, and she wanted to have an open casket because she said, I want the world to see this because there is no way I could tell this story and give them the visual picture of what my son looked like. And her courageous decision helped to spark the civil rights movement. So her legacy lives on through mothers who continue to fight for justice, including my own daughter, who is training her girls upright as social activists. This is my daughter, by the way, if you didn't hear us earlier. So these next pictures are from that exhibit, and some of these are really very disturbing. The song by Billie Holiday that was recorded in 1939, Strange Fruit Hanging from the Poplar Trees, is about lynching. And this quilt on the left is actually made of 1.5-inch squares, every one of which represents an actual African American lynched in something like 32 different states. She took these from statistics that they began tracking in 1885, so that doesn't include the ones who were lynched before 1885. She wanted the different colors to represent, like the red are men and so on, so that represents men, women, and children. So that's a theme that, as unfortunate as it is a part of African American history, and so it has become something that has been used a lot in quilting. So Strange Fruit is a listing of the women who were lynched in 32 states. The quilt's dedicated to Ida B. Wells, the African American journalist who fought for an anti-lynching law in the 1890s. And in 2022, if you remember, President Biden actually signed into law the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, making lynching a federal crime. And then up in the top right-hand corner, this is not a quilt, but it's fabric art that is also part of social protest. And she deconstructed MAGA hats to create this fabric Ku Klux Klan rendition of the infamous Trump slogan. And when Facebook banned her for hate speech, she countered, this is not hate speech, this is art addressing hate speech. A lot of the people who create quilts that are around the theme of lynching use the flag as a symbol. So here you can see Southern Heritage, which is in the top. If you look closely, you can see the shadows of lynched enslaved people or black people in the Confederate flag. And of course, what masquerades as Southern pride, of course, in my opinion, and probably in many of yours too, is really a history of racism and hateful acts. There's also bodies hanging in frayed flag, the bottom left slide or photograph, and then the American flag itself is being lynched and I'm sorry, I don't have the artist for that one, but it makes again, it's fabric art, even though it's not quilting, it's fabric art. So this one is a more hopeful use of colors. This is actually in the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. And this is a freedom quilt from 1975. During the Civil Rights Movement, school kitchen worker Jessie Telfar from Georgia was fired for registering to vote. So in response, she and others pieced this quilt modeled on the American flag. So black bodies have often been used for experimentation, and Shawn Kimber, who I'll mention in a moment, she did the quilt on the right. She tried to, in a lot of her quilts, say about the unfinished business in America. So yeah, so maybe lynching's illegal, and maybe there are laws to protect African Americans and blacks, but of course we all know that it doesn't always work that way, that laws don't always stop people from hateful acts. So in this one, she's talking about Stop the War on Women. And you can see the background is pieced with all little rectangles and squares, and then woven into that are pieces that represent the words. And that's one of her favorite techniques. She often will include one little piece of color to represent hope. And you can see that in the little red square on the right side. So here are two examples of what she talks about. Most of you are probably familiar with Henrietta Lacks, whose cervical cancer cells were taken without her permission and used all over the world for all kinds of experiments and treatments. And she never received anything. They made a film. There was a book written about it, and then there's a film made about it. The circular beads at the bottom represent her immortal cells, and in the middle of the orange part, you can see her standing there. Then for men, we are all warmed by the same sun. This is commemorating the sacrificed lives of the African American men who were subjected without their knowledge or consent to the 40-year Tuskegee study by the U.S. government, in which 600 men were deliberately infected with syphilis and allowed to go untreated even after a cure was discovered. So on the left, Mothers of Gynecology, it honors the enslaved women who were subjected to medical experimentation, including surgery without anesthesia in the 1840s by Dr. Sims, who unfortunately is known as the father of American gynecology. And like so many stories in history, the thing that somebody did that is so-called good is commemorated and mentioned, but then when you really dig down into the history, you find out the really bad stuff behind it and what has happened. So he subjected a lot of women to these treatments without their consent. Today, African American women have the highest rates of death in maternal health care. They're 3 times more likely to die from maternal mortality, often from such factors as hemorrhaging, preeclampsia, cesareans, and structural racism. 2/3 of these deaths are preventable. This quilter says when she was growing up in South Arkansas, there was a root lady in every town. She knew how to go into the woods and come back with potions that would cure you of your ailments. So as she began to make the cauldrons, she wondered, what would a good witch stir into such a pot? What if she could make racism go away? So she added special grass at the bottom with powerful words like courageous, love, hope, things like that, so that a root lady could find just the right ingredients to make a potion to cure racism. This is an African symbol called Sankofa, and it literally is translated from the Twi language of Ghana to say, go back and get it. So the quilter is saying, as people, the forced separation from our ancestry during the transatlantic slave trade has left our story incomplete. The flying bird, flying forward, but looking backward, represents both the wisdom of the past and its benefit to the future. The artist says Sankofa helps us to move ourselves forward with the understanding that we have a rich and beautiful heritage waiting to be reclaimed. Now this quilt is interesting because in the background there are all these squares of batik fabrics that are dark blue, and then the bird itself is made up also of batiks. And those of you who quilt know about batiks. It's really beautiful fabric. All right, this section is about the many Harriet Tubmans, and of course, because she was so inspirational to so many African Americans and people in general, she winds up in a lot of quilts. And you know, she was an Underground Railroad conductor, Civil War hero, humanitarian, and woman suffragist. And she got the West African honorific title of Nana, which elevates her as a person of high esteem. In this quilt, we see her following the North Star, and the escaping people are fashioned with patchwork quilted clothes and bags. A woman called Moses, that was another one of her names because she led her people out of bondage. And again, these are varied quilt styles. To me, it's just really interesting, and I hope you find it that way too, that the same theme can be represented so many different ways in quilt artistry. The one on the right has a quilt beside Harriet Tubman. Bisa Butler is an American fiber artist, and she created a new genre of quilting by creating quilts that look like paintings. And these are two of her representations of Harriet Tubman, and they both hang in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I mean, they're incredible. If you see them up close, just even what she has done with fabric is totally amazing. Again, two different representations of Harriet Tubman. Now, Penny Sisto was not actually a black quilter. Almost all the quilts in my presentation are actually made by black quilters, except for the ones that I made, and Penny Sisto. But she was a midwife, and she lived in Africa. She was influenced by the Maasai women who recycle scraps, such as plastic, tin, and fabric, into art. So she wove those into her presentation. Then on the right, we see Harriet again, and she's pointing to a block in quilting that is called Jacob's Ladder, but it also came to represent the Underground Railroad because it looks like tracks going forward. One thing that's really interesting and I discovered in my research is that Harriet Tubman, who had never been in her life before she escaped and started leading escaped enslaved people, she had never been more than a mile from the plantation where she was born, but she would lie down and take a nap, and in her nap she would dream. You know, back then, of course, there were no satellites, no airplanes, no air balloons, no nothing that you could see from a distance what the earth looked like. She would actually dream the paths to take. She would see the ground below her in the dream, and then when she awoke, she would know how to guide the escaping slaves. I just thought that was incredible when I read about that. Again, look how different these styles are. One of them looks like Harriet Tubman is just walking right out saying, "Come with me, I will take you across." Again, the wall is representing a symbol of how people barricade themselves, try to keep people out, keep people in, whatever. But this woman who did this quilting, she said she learned about this helping hand when she visited her grandmother in Mississippi, and she wanted it to represent how Harriet had gone on to do so many good things in her life, not just escaping slaves, but with suffragists and civil rights activists and all of that. Then on the other side, Brenda Shelby's quilt, see, that's so different because it's very sort of geometric and almost primitive. But again, in the background are those, again, the quilt blocks, which of course have now been deemed as a myth, that those were things that the African Americans used as enslaved people to escape, but they're still represented in the back. And like the one in the top left-hand corner is called Drunkard's Path, and the idea is that if you follow a crooked path through the woods, it's harder to trace or track you. Two more. Toya Thomas uses this discredited, again, slave code quilt blocks and images of Harriet Tubman. And I'm not sure when this was made. I don't have a date on this, but again, people started to use, I think some of the African-American quilters started to use these images in their quilting because of the discredited myth. I'm not really sure how that happened, but whatever. And then Harriet Tubman, again, because she dreamed the paths to freedom, this quilt with traditional African-American fabric, well, African fabrics really, says dream in it. You can see some of the letters that say dream. Now here's another example of a quilt that looks so realistic. I mean, it's incredible. It looks like a photograph, but it's not. It's made out of fabric. And you've heard the saying, Rosa sat so Martin could walk, so Barack could run. So this quilt called The Bus Ride That Paved the Way. You can see Rosa Parks. She's being honored in this quilt, but behind her, you can see the people that either affected by her or did affect her. So there's Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, and then of course Barack and Michelle Obama. And then I have a detail there so you can see the quilt in the background again with the discredited slave blocks in it. So modern quilters today, these are some of the ones that are famous, or people who are in this world know these names. There's only one man, Stephen Towns, and there are a number of women. So we're just going to go through and see some of their work. So Shawn Kimber, who's in the middle top, she actually, I live in Pennsylvania, and Lafayette College is near me, and she taught math at Lafayette College for a long time, but she also was a fabric artist. She did a lot of this sort of technique of words embedded with quilting fabrics. She did a lot of justice teaching also in her math class. So she's associated with the modern quilting movement. This one I think is incredible. This title comes from Eartha Kitt's autobiography. In essence, I am a sophisticated cotton picker because, of course, quilters are using 100%, usually 100% cotton fabric to make their quilts. And so this is something different. They are picking up cotton, but not picking cotton when they were enslaved people. And she uses a lot of patchwork and a lot of denim items that she rips up like jeans and things like that. Not in this particular quilt, but that's one of the most used techniques by her. So these are a few more of her quilts. The one for Eric G., Dying Words of Eric Garner. And I am still, this is I am still, I am not still, I am still not free. And I put some detail there so you can see all the little tiny pieces that she has worked together with the words to make that quilt. A couple more of hers. This one is called Not Showing Proper Deference to White People, which is slang for white people. Kimber says, like the Obamas, the protesting NFL players and myself, many of us are still called uppity Negroes to this day. The middle quilt, Get Woke, Rise Up and Resist. And then she actually said that was, she was motivated actually by the inauguration day and the protests of the Women's March and all, so she decided to make, this is her form of a protest poster, she said. And she said the lines here, the letters flow from red to blue to show that there are people on both sides of the issue who have concerns and who are resisting. Not always the same number of people, but some. Hope half empty. There's teeny little bits of bright colors in there to represent the hope, but this was what she felt when she missed Obama. So this next quilter, this is Bisa Butler. She's the one who did the two different incredible portraits of Harriet Tubman, younger and older, that are in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So this is the kind of thing she does, which is, again, it looks almost like a painting, doesn't it? I mean, it's like, you can't even believe that this is quilting, fabric art. So a lot of the more modern quilters are experimenting with a lot of different techniques. She was commissioned to quilt cover images for Time magazine, including the Person of the Year issue, which is Wangari Maathai. I'm not sure quite how to pronounce that, but she was the first woman in Central and East Africa to earn a PhD. Clara Nardi, she had a fascination with African American hair, so a lot of her artwork, and she actually does something called thread painting, where she uses a sewing machine where the sewing machine needle acts as the drawing instrument, the pen, and the threads are her inks, and the fabrics are her drawing surface. So she experimented with something really different. And a lot of her work is about women's identity, African American women's, again, especially hair. So Faith Ringgold, she's extremely varied. You know, actually, when I was here in March, January, I was up when Martin Luther King Day was on that Monday, and the museum in Worcester was actually going to stay open when normally it's closed on Monday because they had her as an exhibit, and so they wanted people to come and see that. I was going to go to it, but we had a snowstorm, and I wound up driving home Monday instead of Tuesday, but I missed that because she has since passed away. But she does story quilts. The one that you see on the left celebrates African American women who changed the world: Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Madam C.J. Walker, Ida B. Wells, Mary McLeod Bethune, Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, and Ella Baker. And they're being approached by the artist Vincent van Gogh, who is carrying sunflowers. That's what says Sunflowers Quilting Bee at Arles. The middle quilt, you probably can't see it that well, but it's trying to focus on, it's called Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima, because it fictionally revises the most maligned black female stereotype. And then the one in the bottom represents that many African American women feel they don't fit the cultural ideal, whatever that is, of beauty. And so this is a performance story quilt where these women would lose over 100, and again, it's a myth, a mythical story, but they'd lose over 100 pounds to achieve this look of beauty in American culture. Now, Avis Collins Robinson, she actually, I'll talk a little bit about Gee's Bend later, but she studied with the Gee's Bend women, and she was very captivated by their techniques, so she started using it and doing modern quilting. And I'm just remembering here that both of these women have passed away, both Faith Ringgold this year, excuse me, and Ava Collins Robinson last year. This is the one male African-American quilter I found out about, Stephen Towns, on the right. On the left, I'm sorry, I don't have who that artist is, but on the right is Stephen Towns, and he does things that are very realistic. All of his quilts have a butterfly somewhere in it to represent metamorphosis, and if you look closer, you can see the stippling around the quilter's head. It's supposed to look like a halo. These are other quilts. These are actually panels that are in the National African American History in the Smithsonian in D.C. And this is supposed to represent the enslaved people, again, who were carried across in the Middle Passage, and it's to pay homage to all of the people unknown. And the bottom quilting portion is what's called strip quilting. Now, this exhibit was absolutely incredible. Patricia Montgomery, this was at the National Paducah Quilt Museum. What she did is she took about 20 African-American civil rights leaders, and she created coats that were hanging from the ceiling. So what she did is she took that image of something hanging in lynching and turned it into a celebration of protest, of civil rights movement, and all of that. So the next couple of slides, I don't really have time, given our time here, to go through all the detail why she chose each one, but every one of these quilts had next to it a panel explaining why she chose that person as a representation of a civil rights leader that should be remembered. And she said she was struck by the contrast of the cruelty of lynching with hanging with the beauty of quilts, and that's what she wanted to represent. So here we have some of them. Doll remap. And again, if we had more time, I would give you the history that's represented on the coats, because I have notes about all of that. But really just kind of focus on the beauty of the quilting that she has done. Every single swing coat is completely different, with different techniques and different fabrics. And of course, some of these, one of them that of course you'll represent that's the infamous Pettus Bridge. And this was Amelia Boynton Robinson, and she is, you can see her being attacked in the middle slide in 1965, and in 2015, she is in the wheelchair next to Barack Obama crossing the Pettus Bridge. She was injured in Bloody Sunday. This is Ann Moody, who wrote Coming of Age in Mississippi. So all these people, again, if I could tell you the whole history, some of it you will know. You'll know that they're involved in NAACP, they're involved in SNCC, they're involved in CORE. And so what the fabric artist did in this case was bring in aspects of their own personal history into each different swing coat. And they're called swing coats because they have like more of a triangular shape, you know, so that it flows in the air as you walk. Carlotta Wells, she was one of the Little Rock Nine. See the high school there. Daisy Bates, she was one of the Little Rock Nine also. Her house was the safe home for the Little Rock Nine. They would meet there before they were transported to school. And Claudetta Colvin was actually arrested before Rosa Parks. She was arrested in 1955 for refusing to surrender her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery. See the bus on the coat. Diana Nash, she became a leader of the first successful civil rights campaign to integrate lunch counters. This one, Dorothy Height, I didn't actually know anything about this person, but she was appalled to learn that her race barred her from swimming at the pool in the local YWCA. She was accepted to Barnard College, but she was denied entrance because of the school's unwritten policy of admitting only 2 black students per year. She was a prize-winning orator, and she was asked not to speak at the March on Washington. I don't know if you know that history, but women were very upset because they had done so much of the trench work for the civil rights movement, and they weren't allowed to speak at the March on Washington. Dorothy Cotton, she says, the civil rights movement that rearranged the social order of this country did not emanate from the halls of Harvard, Princeton, and Cornell. It came from simple people who learned that they had the right to stand tall and that nobody can ride a back that isn't bent. Fannie Lou Hamer, most of you know about her. I know my daughter does. She founded the Freedom Farm Cooperative to empower poor black farmers and sharecroppers. And see, this coat is supposed to look like fields of things growing, you know, like in a farm. So that's where the creator of this show was so creative in using not only the symbols on the coats, but the colors and the fabrics that she chose for each quilt. This blew me away when I learned this story. Ida Mae Holland, she was raped when she was 11 years old, and that led her to prostitution. So in her late teens, she followed a young man into his office, hoping he'd be a customer, but it turned out he was a volunteer for SNCC, and he was registering Negro voters in Greenwood, Mississippi, and that encounter transformed her life. She eventually received a PhD and became a professor and a playwright. That's her play, Mississippi Delta. A woman who was very crucial to the Montgomery bus boycott. She stayed up all night mimeographing 52,000 handbills calling for the boycott, which was intended for one day but went on for 13 months. This is the kind of stuff that I learned on that civil rights trip by Rhodes Scholar, things that I did not know previously. This swing coat is an homage to the Lovings. You may know that story. Richard Loving, a white man, was sentenced to a year in prison for violating Virginia's anti-miscegenation statute that prohibited marriage between people classified as white and people of color. And the 1967 unanimous Supreme Court decision ruled this unconstitutional. Polly Murray was a civil rights and women's rights activist lawyer. She was denied entry into Harvard because of her gender, but she became the first African American to receive a law degree from Yale Law School. Modesta Simpkins. She was involved in African American public health and social reform. And Sarah Mae Fleming. After being assaulted on a bus for sitting in the wrong seat, this case provided the legal roadmap for Rosa Parks' case more than a year later. Septima Poncetta Clark was an American educator teaching African Americans to read. And Ruby Doris Smith Robinson was a Spelman College student and became involved in SNCC. So now this section is quilts that were dedicated to John Lewis. So the Southern Poverty Law Center, which many of you probably know well about, I've been a donator to it monthly for 30 years, they did their first ever traveling exhibit, and they called it Good Trouble Quilts, celebrating the life and legacy of John Lewis. And so you can see, I mean, it's like amazing if you can see this up close, because there's thousands of teeny little squares in the quilt on the left. And in the quilt on the right, you can see words like bridge, rights, good trouble, and so on. Of course, you know that he was attacked crossing the Pettus Bridge, and he's best remembered for those words, good trouble. And here he is, wrapped in a quilt. I love that. And then the one on the left represents different things that the Freedom Riders encountered and challenged. So again, these are more of the quilts in that traveling exhibit. The Selma to Montgomery March on the left. Letter from a Birmingham jail on the right. And if you can look closely, I have a little arrow there. The word injustice is little letters at the bottom of the quilt, but it's fractured because justice has been fractured. Hands that pick cotton can now pick our elected officials. You can see putting a vote in the ballot box. John Lewis was from Troy. This is, modern photographs combined with African fabrics. And then remembering Mother Lewis. This was really cool. I was actually reading John Lewis's autobiography on the civil rights trip, and I remembered this line when I saw this quilt. When he went home, his mother would never say, "How's the movement?" She'd always say, "So how are you, son?" And Still We Rise, that's a book that explains Journey to Freedom through quilts. They're important to America and Black culture in particular because the art form was historically one of the few mediums accessible to marginalized groups to tell their own story. Quilts are our portals to understanding the past to inform our present. I would say that a lot of quilters do story quilts, but not nearly as much as African Americans, because again, that was one of the ways they could represent their history. So let's see, like subject-wise, okay, quilts of influential women. So this is Phyllis Wheatley, first African-American writer, and she inspired generations like Octavia Butler. Some of you might have read Kindred or Parable of the Sower or Parable of the Talents. Octavia Butler has been rediscovered, but she died young, and a lot of people didn't even know about her. I've been a science fiction and visionary fiction, speculative fiction writer since I was 11 years old, and I did not know about Octavia Butler until about 10 years ago. I thought I knew all of them, but that just shows you how history can be suppressed if you're Black. Then the middle one, Harriet Beecher Stowe, those are actually pages that the quilter worked into the quilt, pages from Uncle Tom's Cabin. I mean, that's so creative. I mean, just imagine that. Like, here's this woman who set the world on fire with understanding what it was like to be an enslaved person, at least for her day. And then on the right, Ida B. Wells, again, who initiated the first anti-lynching campaign in the United States. And in the left-hand corner, she is grasping the power of the words. See, the roots of the tree are words that she wrote. Fascinating. I mean, the creativity is amazing. So these are influential men, early freedom fighters. Frederick Douglass on the left. Crispus Attucks, who died in 1770. The quilt maker wanted to remind us that Black people have paid the price for freedom by having to fight for it, so it looks like a shield. That quilt looks like a shield. And then the last one is for Levi Coffin, and he's credited with establishing the Underground Railroad, and all those little circles are stops on the Underground Railroad. Reconstruction, again, lynching, symbols of hanging. And on the right, that quilt hangs in the new Museum of African American History in Jackson, Mississippi. This next quilt is also in Jackson, Mississippi. Her father was murdered by white men when she was 10 years old. This was 1939. So she made this memory quilt made in 1993 to describe her life after her father's death. Madam C.J. Walker. How many of you know she was the first self-made female millionaire in America? She made, manufactured and sold beauty products for black women. And then on the right, this guy, I didn't know about him either, Garrett Augusta Morgan. He was an inventor, sometimes known as the Black Edison. He invented the gas mask, the traffic light, the zigzag attachment for the sewing machine. Amazing. There was a little museum in, I think it was Selma, that had all about the inventions that he had created. But again, suppression of history. Kathy Williams was the only, that we know of, documented woman to enlist and serve in the regular U.S. Army in the 19th century. She went in as a man and she wasn't discovered for 2 years. And on the right, this is African American nurses who served in the U.S. Armed Forces since the Civil War, both paid and unpaid. And so there's all kinds of memorabilia in that quilt. Again, you know, just look, I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about every quilt, but you know, just what I'm hoping to communicate to you is the incredible creativity and artistry of different ways to represent things. The one on the left, Harlem Renaissance, you know, you can see some of the people you might recognize there. And the Lovings quilt, we talked about the Lovings, the mixed race couple. Muhammad Ali. This was an interesting description because the public sees him as black and white. This is what he is. He's a black boxer. But he sees himself in the full array of colors in the mirror. And then the other one, Katrina Wreckage. That one, I just thought this one was incredible. You can see the flag in the middle, and around it are some skulls of people who died in the hurricane. This was what it was like to be in New Orleans without any help, food, water, housing, medicine, and so forth. You can see the collapsing buildings with the black bodies underneath. I actually visited the 9th Ward about 9 months after the hurricane on a mission trip, not from my church, but I'm a Unitarian also, but in Pennsylvania, but from a friend's Christian church. And she asked me if I would like to go, and I said absolutely. And it was incredible to see the devastation in the 9th Ward. Now we have the arts, poetry. I know why the caged bird beats his wings. The words actually come from a poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, an African-American poet and writer. And the bars in both quilts symbolize the imprisoning bars of limitations that are put on one by others. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. This quilter made those are different sort of free-form quilt blocks, and they're supposed to represent the stained glass windows that were broken and spread out all over the place after the bombing. And then on the right, you see black hands pulling Emmett Tills from the water. This quilter said she used techniques she had never used before, but they seemed to just flow into her hands in order to create this really painful quilted reminder. This shows a very different, thematically, a mother's love, but look how different they are. Different styles. Very realistic, sort of African fabrics, very sort of primitive. And that's a universal thing, a mother loving her child, no matter how much or little melanin is in the skin. So you probably remember that picture of the little black girl standing awestruck before the First Lady portrait of Michelle Obama. Well, it went viral on the internet, so this quilter decided to make a quilt that represented that. And again, you know, it looks like a photograph, but it's actually fabrics. And the little girl is wearing a coat that is embroidered with words that Michelle Obama has inspired. Dream, you know, positivity, culture, perseverance. And the cowrie shells are, you know, very prevalent in African art. These are different renditions of Obama. The Hope for Change inspired many different quilters. The ones in the middle that have a black frame around them are from the Social Justice Sewing Academy, which I'll mention in a moment. Images of freedom, yes we can, with the phoenix rising out of the ashes. And there are named words there who preceded Obama, like Thurgood Marshall. And the one on the right, 400 Years of African American History, that's, the edges on that are purposely left raw because the work of social justice, racial justice is not done. Social justice, breaking the bonds of slavery, we are still not there. And the Advocate, which represents Thurgood Marshall's appointment to the Supreme Court. Those of you who are quilters, that is courthouse block at the bottom. And then the middle one is called barrister's block, which I didn't even know there was such a block until I was doing my research. And then at the top are the scales of justice. Juneteenth. Again, as an educated audience, you probably are very familiar with Juneteenth. However, I did not even know about Juneteenth until I was, I think, 50. Traditional fabrics. A lot of collage type activity in African American quilting. So how many of you know about Gee's Bend? Gee's Bend quilting. Okay, some of you, good. Okay, so it's really interesting. It's a little community southwest of Selma, Alabama, and these women had created this sort of unique style out of old clothes. And they were discovered in the 1990s by an artist who was roaming around, and he saw one of these quilts, and he came up and he offered, I don't know, $4,000 or $5,000 for one of them. And these women were like, what? You know? But now there's a Gee's Bend Quilt Collective, and they make quilts and sell them. And they also, some of the women teach a workshop. So I'll just show you some more of their quilts. And if you saw the quilts over there that I brought, that's because I went to a Gee's Bend quilting retreat in Jackson, Mississippi, run by a woman who was very interested in Gee's Bend quilting, but she brings in these two women, petways, and they're not, well, they're related, but distantly, but they're not actually related like it's in sisters today. And they teach the course, they teach you how to be much more free with your quilting, which was really interesting for me because I always had done this sort of precise reproduction quilt things with, you know, Civil War patterns and stuff. So these are some more of their quilts. You can see in this one, the middle, the detail, the words vote are in all of those bars in between. I thought that was really fascinating. There's a little story about this. Martin Luther King went to visit Gee's Bend in a heavy rain. He was promoting civil rights and voting, of course, and he said, I came over here to Gee's Bend to tell you, you are somebody. A woman remembers he was talking about how we should wait on a bus to come, and we were all going to go to march. We got loaded on the bus, but we didn't get a chance to do it because we got put in jail. Now, because the residents of Gee's Bend tried to close the ferry, when they tried to register to vote, they lost the ferry that connected them in a direct route to the outside road because they're in a bend in the river, and there's a little teeny road, one road that goes in, but there used to be a ferry that went back and forth across the river. And the sheriff at the time said, well, we didn't close the ferry because they were black, it's because they forgot they were black. So this is a book that just came out about a woman's story of her grieving, when she was grieving her mother, who was a quilter. She's a Gee's Bend woman. So this is a couple of pictures of the retreat that I went to. Those are the two women, the Petway sisters, and then it's my friend Veronica and me. And the quilts that you see over on that table, most of them I made there. So that was the quilting retreat we were at. And later I discovered Ava Collins Robinson's Sharecroppers masterpiece, which is in the top left-hand corner there. And I was so taken with it that I created my own version. So the one in the middle is the one I made, and because the Geesben women teach you not to waste anything and use scraps, the back of that quilt that I made has that in the lower right-hand corner. So it's scraps, and they really taught us this slash and re-sewing technique, which was really interesting. Again, these are my first attempts to create Geesben style quilts. So I just love this particular, and have any of you read the story by Alice Walker called Everyday Use? Anyone familiar with that? Well, you quilters out there must read that, because it's about an African-American woman who has two daughters. Dee is the highly educated sister who only wants the family heirloom quilts to display in her home for their artistic value, whereas her sister Maggie and her mother cherish these items because they remind them of their loved ones. In Mama's mind, Maggie learning to quilt and putting it to everyday use is preserving the culture, which is how Mama believes the quilt should be used. Dee believes the proper way to preserve her culture is to display the quilt in her home and preserve the quilt itself. Quilts are made up of fragments of family history, and it's just interesting to see how each sister wants to preserve that in a totally different way. A lot of people make quilts just for your bed, to keep you warm, but a quilt is more. It represents safekeeping, beauty, and you could say it represents family history. Now, this woman is not a quilter, but I just put a couple of slides in here by her. Ayanna Jackson took the story, The Deep, which has a long history on how it came about. It's about enslaved women in Africa on the Middle Passage who were thrown overboard or jumped overboard, and their babies were born with gills and developed a civilization under the ocean. You can actually get this book. It's a fascinating story. She was so taken with it that she created all of these costumes out of things that you would find cast up on beaches and seaweed and all kinds of things like this. The dress that you see there is made of Ghanaian banknotes. This was at the National Museum of African Art. And again, these are some of the more costumes that she made, which are just incredible. So we're coming up in the last few slides. This is a collective. The Brown Sugar Stitchers Quilt Guild are women who get together, tell their stories, they quilt. They've made hundreds of quilts for a children's orphanage named for an African-American maid in Atlanta who in the 1800s started using a boxcar to care for abandoned infants who were left at a railroad station. So these are some of their quilts. And then we have the Social Justice Sewing Academy. The nearest chapter of this is actually not too far from you. It's in Lowell, Massachusetts. Sarah Trail was a teenager when Trayvon Martin was murdered, and she wanted to go on a march, but her mother wouldn't let her. So she made this quilt, Rest in Power, Trayvon, and after that she decided, she went on to college. She received her master's in education from Harvard. She wrote a book, and she now teaches people how to bring together, especially teenagers of color, to represent things that matter to them in their lives, especially African Americans who have been murdered by gun violence, police violence, and others. And so these are some of the quilts that her students have made. She has a book that's fabulous if you ever want to get it. Then she also does community quilts, where if a teenager doesn't want to make a whole quilt, they can make a block, a standard size, and then she puts them together in community quilts. So I love this. This is the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who actually went to speak at the Quilts and Human Rights exhibit. And he said, America is more like a quilt, many patches, many pieces, many colors, and many sizes, all woven together by a common thread. Stitching Stolen Lives takes the idea of the quilt to a different an even deeper psychological and spiritual level. And Hillary Clinton, each quilt is an invitation to speak out, organize, lobby, and use all our skills to make our neighborhoods and our nation places filled with joy and possibility rather than fear. Every stitch in a quilt is a bold, brave stride toward that safer and more just world. So these are some of the books that I used. Of the photographs I could take myself, I did. Many of them I took myself of these quilts, the swing quilts, the American, one that was at the Paducah Museum on women, and the ones that I took in the National History of Culture and National Museum of American History and Culture, and other ones like that. But where I wasn't able to photograph the actual quilt, I used these books and took pictures from these quilts, so I just want to credit them. So in closing, quilts are a truly American story in the magic of cloth, serving as a visual document and presenting a compelling narrative. Cloth is comforting, cloth is wrapping that all humans know, cloth is non-threatening. Through the medium of cloth, we travel from story to story through time and space. And why quilts? Because quilting is one of America's most popular powerful art forms, and with its widespread appeal and its association with comfort, warmth, and healing. And the Black quilters say, we never said no white people, we just want you to know you shouldn't be the hero of the story. And there I am with my quilt. That's it.